Hey legends, welcome to Mad Historian, where history isn't clean. It's corrupt, cursed, and completely out of pocket. Tonight, we're diving into the twisted love lives of medieval kings rulers who ruled with one hand and sinned with the other. From secret lovers hidden in castle walls to courts that doubled as dens of obsession, these were the monarchs the church tried to silence. We've got royal blood, bedroom scandals, forbidden pleasures, and power plays that'd make Game of Thrones look like a bedtime story. So light a candle, lock the door, and hit that like button, because Mad Historian is about to expose the filth behind the throne. You stand on the precipice of a world long buried, a world where the very notion of power became a corrosive acid, eating away at the boundaries of human decency and twisting desires into grotesque forms. Imagine yourself, a silent, unseen observer, a mere shadow clinging to the cold stone of a medieval castle's forgotten passageways. The air here, thick with the scent of stale wine and unwashed bodies, is a stark, almost sickening contrast to the vibrant, pious scenes embroidered on the tapestries that adorn the main halls. Those tapestries, depicting virtuous knights, chaste ladies, and saintly monarchs, were a carefully woven deception. The reality behind these opulent facades was far, far more sinister, a chilling tableau of human nature at its most unhinged. We're not talking about simple, forgivable debauchery here. We're delving into the abyss, into the hidden chambers and shadowed alcoves where kings, cloaked in what they believed was a divine right to rule, indulged in practices so shocking, so utterly depraved, they would sicken even the most jaded modern sensibilities. Forget the romanticized notions of chivalry and courtly love you might have absorbed from tales and legends. That was merely a thin, fragile veneer, a beautiful lie painted over a festering core of perversion and unchecked power. This journey is a descent not just into history, but into the darkest corners of medieval royalty, a period where absolute power truly did corrupt absolutely. The consequences of this corruption weren't just personal. They rippled outwards, tearing at the moral fabric of entire kingdoms, affecting the lives of countless voiceless subjects. What unholy secrets did these thick, unforgiving stone walls keep locked away for centuries? What unimaginable horrors were committed under the watchful, yet eternally silent gaze of the gargoyles perched high above, their grotesque faces perhaps a reflection of the depravity within? You're about to find out, and the truth might just turn your stomach. This isn't just about dates and names. It's an immersive plunge into the lived experience of a past era, a chilling reminder of what happens when moral and ethical boundaries cease to exist for those at the very pinnacle of society. You'll walk the same uneven flagstone floors where unfathomable acts transpired, breathe the same damp, musty air that clung to secrets for centuries, seeping into the very mortar. We will explore the lives of monarchs whose reigns were marked not just by political intrigue and warfare, but by deeply disturbing personal proclivities, often at the direct expense of their subjects' well-being and the fragile moral compass of their societies. Prepare to challenge every romanticized notion you hold about medieval power, because here, the divine right of kings sometimes manifested as a divine, unquestionable right to depravity. Are you truly ready to witness the authentic, unvarnished face of medieval power, stripped bare of its romanticized veneer, and discover what lurked beneath the gilded crowns? You find yourself transported to the early 14th century, specifically to the turbulent and increasingly fractious court of King Edward II of England. The year is 1307, and a new monarch has ascended to the throne, not with the expected gravitas and assured command, but with a palpable sense of unease and outright hostility rippling through the powerful English nobility. You hear the whispers, hushed and furtive, echoing off the high ceilings, centering on the king's favorites, particularly one Piers Gaveston, a charming but deeply arrogant Gascon knight. It's not just the lavish gifts showered upon him titles, like Earl of Cornwall, vast estates, and even the regalia meant for the king himself that raise eyebrows. It's the intimate, almost obsessive, nature of their relationship that truly fuels the resentment. You see Edward's behavior firsthand. He showers Gaveston with affection, often in public, an open display of favoritism that flies defiantly in the face of established royal protocol and the expectations of a medieval king's comportment. Chroniclers of the time, constrained by the social and religious norms that condemned same-sex relationships as sodomy and a grave sin, used veiled yet unmistakably clear language to describe their bond. The author of the Vita Edwardi Secundi, a contemporary account, explicitly states that the king loved him beyond measure, making him his inseparable companion, using every device to please him. This was no mere friendship or political alliance. It was an all-consuming devotion that overshadowed Edward's duties to his kingdom, his nobles, and crucially, his queen, Isabella of France. Imagine the outrage of powerful barons like Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, the king's cousin, who saw their ancient influence usurped by a charismatic, arrogant foreigner, a man who openly mocked them and controlled access to the king's ear. You witnessed the growing chasm between Edward and his magnates, a rift fueled not only by Gaveston's arrogance and the immense wealth he accumulated, but by what they perceived as an unnatural and politically dangerous obsession that threatened the very legitimacy of the throne. Edward's defiance of societal norms, his public displays of affection for Gaveston, and his showering of royal patronage upon him led to repeated exiles for Gaveston, each time followed by Edward's desperate pleas for his return, further inflaming the nobility. This culminated in brutal civil strife, and ultimately, the baron's desperate decision to execute Gaveston in 1312 without the king's permission, a direct challenge to royal authority. The very stability of the realm seemed to hinge on this peculiar, almost defiant relationship, a bond that dared to challenge the strictures of medieval masculinity and monarchical duty. What exactly was the true forbidden nature of their connection? And how far was Edward willing to go to protect his beloved favorite, even if it meant alienating his entire kingdom and facing a gruesome, deeply disturbing end to his own reign? The shadow of this scandalous devotion would cling to Edward's name long after his tragic demise. The air chills and thickens with a sinister intent as you shift from the English court's domestic scandals to the ruthless, calculated machinations of Philip IV of France, known to history as Philip the Fair. It's a Friday, October 13th, 1307, a date forever etched in infamy, when a chilling decree echoes throughout the length and breadth of the kingdom. All members of the immensely powerful and wealthy Knights Templar are to be simultaneously arrested. The charges are numerous and utterly shocking: heresy, idolatry, blasphemy, and, most disturbingly, unnatural acts, including sodomy, kissing idols, and spitting on the cross. You witness the sudden, brutal efficiency of these arrests, coordinated across France, the once invincible military monastic order crumbling overnight under the weight of royal power. Philip, a king desperate for funds to finance his perpetual wars and consolidate his power against the papacy, manufactured a meticulously constructed web of accusations. These were not random claims. They were specifically designed to shock, disgust, and utterly delegitimize the Templars in the eyes of a deeply religious and superstitious populace. You hear the confessions, extracted under unimaginable, excruciating torture methods, sanctioned by the Inquisition, which Philip expertly manipulated for his own ends. Imagine the terror, the sheer physical and psychological desperation that would lead men, once lauded as crusading heroes, to confess to such heinous deeds, regardless of their truth. They describe bizarre initiation rituals involving spitting on the cross, denying Christ 3 times, and performing acts of mutual sodomy or unnatural vice between members, even kissing the posterior of their superiors. The accusations of sodomy were particularly potent and strategically deployed, a guaranteed way to paint the Templars as an organization steeped in unspeakable perversion and deserving of complete annihilation. Philip knew the immense power of such charges to turn public opinion, to portray a picture of an organization so morally corrupt that its destruction was a righteous act, a cleansing of evil from the heart of Christendom. While the primary motive was undeniably financial, the Templars possessed vast treasures and lands, and political. Their independence was a threat to royal authority. The sheer scale and depravity of the alleged acts, whether true or coerced, highlight the medieval mind's capacity for inventing and believing truly twisted narratives, particularly when fueled by monarchical ambition and religious fervor. The carefully staged public trials, orchestrated by the king and his loyal inquisitors, served as a massive propaganda campaign to justify the dissolution of an order that had simply become too wealthy, too powerful, and too independent for Philip's liking. You ponder the sheer audacity of Philip's gambit, the chilling effectiveness of using such shocking, sexually charged claims to achieve his aims, and the profound injustice visited upon thousands of innocent men. But what hidden truths lay beneath these forced confessions? And how did a king justify such widespread torture, murder, and the obliteration of a respected order to seize immense power and wealth, leaving a stain on the history of the French monarchy that lingers to this day? You find yourself immersed in the turbulent and universally reviled reign of King John of England, 1199 to 1216, a monarch whose name has become, perhaps more than any other English king, synonymous with tyranny, treachery, and moral depravity. The early 13th century, his period of rule, was a time of intense political turmoil, marked by crushing taxes, lost territories in France, and constant rebellion from his barons. But beyond his military ineptitude and financial extortion, the whispers in the court, in the castles of his disgruntled nobility, and even among the common folk were of a far more personal and deeply disturbing nature. You hear tales recounted with barely contained horror by contemporary chroniclers such as Roger of Wendover and Matthew Paris, the foremost historians of the St. Albans Abbey, renowned for their detailed, if sometimes biased, accounts of the period. They speak of John's insatiable appetites and his utter, contemptuous disregard for the sanctity of marriage vows and the honor of his subjects' families. It's widely recorded that he would seize noble women, often from prominent, powerful families, and force them into sexual relations. Imagine the profound fear and utter helplessness of these women, their families powerless against the king's desires, their honor irrevocably stained. John believed his royal prerogative placed him above all law, including the moral and social codes that governed every other man. One particularly shocking account details his alleged affair with Isabella de Warenne, the wife of Eustace de Vesey, a powerful baron who later became a key figure in the baronial rebellion. Wendover recounts how John kept her for himself for a considerable time, a blatant act of marital abduction and adultery. Even more brazenly, he supposedly tried to force himself upon the sister of Alexander II of Scotland, a profound diplomatic and personal insult. This wasn't just about illicit affairs or secret mistresses, which were common among medieval monarchs. It was about the brutal, open assertion of power, a king using his supreme position to satisfy his base, predatory desires with utter impunity, viewing women as mere objects to be taken and discarded, regardless of their marital status or social standing. The chroniclers frequently condemned his insatiable lust and lasciviousness, listing it alongside his cruelty, avarice, and betrayal as primary reasons for the widespread discontent and eventual outright rebellion that plagued his reign. His personal conduct was seen as deeply intertwined with his political struggles, revealing a king who was not only militarily inept and politically treacherous, but morally corrupt to his core. These shocking acts contributed significantly to the animosity he faced from his barons, driving them to form a unified front. Their desire to curtail such unchecked royal abuses, including the sexual exploitation of their female relatives, was a crucial factor that ultimately led to the momentous signing of the Magna Carta at Runnymede in 1215. This pivotal document, a foundational text of English liberty, was partly born out of a desperate need to restrain a king who believed himself utterly above all law, even those governing personal conduct and the honor of his nobility. What kind of king truly believes himself utterly above all law, even those governing personal conduct and the very sanctity of family? And what does it ultimately take to finally bring such a self-proclaimed tyrant to heel, forcing him to concede even a modicum of shared governance? Shift your gaze to the French court in the early 14th century, specifically to the brief and ill-fated reign of Louis X, the Quarreler, reigned 1314 to 1316. You stand among the assembled courtiers, observing a king who, despite his mere 2 years on the throne, left behind a legacy indelibly tinged with scandal and moral decay. His first marriage, a political union to Margaret of Burgundy, was a disaster from its inception, famously exploding into public infamy with the Tour de Nesle affair in 1314. You hear the shocking rumors, confirmed by later investigations and confessions, that Margaret, along with her sisters-in-law, Blanche and Joan, wives of Louis's brothers, the future Philip V and Charles IV, had been engaging in long-term adulterous relationships with 2 young Norman knights, Philip and Gauthier d'Aunay. The scandal was unprecedented and seismic. It rocked the very foundations of the Capetian monarchy, which had, until then, enjoyed an almost unbroken reputation for moral rectitude and dynastic legitimacy. Margaret was accused of having taken knights as lovers over several years, using the secluded Tour de Nesle tower overlooking the Seine as their clandestine meeting place. She, along with Blanche, was arrested, publicly disgraced, and imprisoned in the fearsome Chateau Galliard, where Margaret mysteriously died in 1315. Her lovers were brutally tortured, flayed alive, castrated, and then hanged, their bodies displayed to the horrified public, a chilling testament to the severity with which royal adultery was punished. While the primary focus of the scandal was undeniably on the queens and their audacious illicit affairs, the implications for Louis were profound and devastating. His marriage was a public humiliation, his authority undermined, and the very legitimacy of his potential heirs from Margaret was called into question, creating a severe succession crisis for the Capetian dynasty. But beyond the rampant adultery that directly impacted him, whispers persisted about Louis himself. Some chronicles hinted a man with peculiar tastes, a king who, despite his marital failures, seemed to struggle to maintain an heir, potentially due to his own dissipated lifestyle and alleged debauchery, rather than merely bad luck. While direct accusations of perversion against Louis are less explicit than those against his English counterpart, Edward II, the atmosphere of his court, as undeniably revealed by the Tour de Nesle affair, speaks volumes about a pervasive moral laxity. It suggests a monarchy where traditional moral boundaries were blurred, where personal vices, including sexual transgressions, spilled openly into the public sphere with devastating consequences, eroding the sanctity of the royal line and creating deep public cynicism. The chronicler Geoffroy de Paris, writing at the time, alluded to Louis's general lack of moral fiber and his indulgence in sinful ways, hinting at more than just a passive role in the court's decline. Imagine the psychological toll of such a public betrayal on a monarch whose entire legitimacy rested on his lineage and the perceived purity of his bloodline. This widespread scandal, deeply rooted in the sexual lives of the French royal family, created an environment where suspicion, depravity, and political instability permeated the very air of the palace, leaving a lasting scar on the Capetian dynasty. What kind of court allows such rampant depravity and scandal to flourish at its very heart? And how does a king navigate a realm where his own reputation, and indeed his lineage, is sullied by the actions of those closest to him? You're transported back to England, to the mid-13th century, specifically to the long and often beleaguered reign of King Henry III, 1216 to 1272. While his story doesn't involve the overt carnal perversions of some of his predecessors or successors, Henry's reign reveals a different, yet equally compelling, kind of twisted obsession. His fervent and almost fanatical devotion to religious relics and his perceived, almost mystical, divine connection. You witness his extravagant and often economically ruinous spending on acquiring religious artifacts, often at the direct expense of his kingdom's treasury and the dire needs of his subjects. Imagine the awe and perhaps profound dismay of seeing a king pour colossal sums into acquiring a phial containing what was purported to be the holy blood of Christ from the Master of the Knights Templar in 1247. This was not a discreet acquisition. Henry celebrated its arrival with immense fanfare, personally carrying it on foot in a grand procession through the streets of London, bareheaded and dressed humbly, to deposit it at Westminster Abbey. He also acquired a piece of the true cross and other sacred objects, believing them to be powerful conduits of divine favor. His fascination wasn't merely pious, a simple expression of Christian devotion. It bordered on a fetishistic adoration, a deep-seated belief that these objects held immense supernatural power and would grant him divine protection and infallible favor. He embarked on the monumental and incredibly costly rebuilding of Westminster Abbey, transforming it from a mere church into a magnificent, unparalleled shrine designed specifically to house these precious relics, a testament to his spiritual fixations. The abbey, largely consecrated in 1269, became the physical embodiment of his all-consuming spiritual quest, draining vast resources that could have been used to alleviate widespread poverty, fund necessary infrastructure, or strengthen his defenses against rebellious barons. This obsession, while seemingly benign or even commendable in a religious sense, had profoundly perverse consequences for his kingdom. It severely drained the royal coffers, leading to increased and resented taxation among his subjects and constant financial demands on his barons, fueling widespread discontent and eventually erupting into open rebellion during the Second Barons' War, led by Simon de Montfort. Chroniclers like Matthew Paris, despite being generally sympathetic to the king's piety, repeatedly noted the severe strain this placed on the royal finances and the patience of the English people, who saw their king prioritizing abstract spiritual treasures over their very real material needs. You see how this seemingly innocent devotion warped into a destructive force, eroding trust and stability within the kingdom, as the monarch's personal obsession became an intolerable public burden. Henry's piety, pushed to an extreme, became a form of self-indulgence, a king prioritizing his personal spiritual pursuits over the practical, worldly governance of his realm, creating a profound imbalance that threatened the stability of his rule. How does a king's spiritual fervor become such a devastating burden, rather than a blessing, for his people, when it consumes their resources, their patience, and ultimately, their loyalty? Now, prepare yourself for a truly horrifying descent into the darkest, most unfathomable corners of medieval depravity, a story so monstrous it seems plucked from the most chilling nightmares. You are in 15th century France, amidst the weary aftermath of the 100 Years' War, a time of chaos and societal breakdown. The name that echoes in hushed, terrified whispers, a name synonymous with pure evil, is Gilles de Rais. He was a nobleman of immense wealth and power, a baron of Brittany and Poitou, a former companion-in-arms to the revered Joan of Arc, and even a marshal of France, a national hero. But behind this veneer of chivalry, immense prestige, and military glory lay a monster, a predator of unimaginable cruelty. Between 1432 and 1440, de Rais engaged in a systematic, meticulously planned series of unspeakable acts, drawing countless children, primarily young boys from peasant families, to his various formidable castles, most notably Château de Tiffauges in the Loire Valley, and his residence in the city of Nantes. They were lured with deceptive promises of gifts, education, and employment as pages. You hear the gruesome, chilling details of his confessions, extracted during his ecclesiastical and secular trials in Nantes in September and October of 1440. These confessions, corroborated by the testimony of his surviving accomplices, his steward Henriette and his chaplain Eustache Blanted, and the discovery of numerous human remains, detailed the torture, sexual abuse, and ritualistic murder of an estimated 80 to 200 children, though some estimates run even higher. Imagine the pervasive, gnawing terror that must have gripped the surrounding villages and towns, as children vanished without a trace, their desperate parents left with only unanswered prayers and mounting dread. De Rais's motivations were complex and deeply twisted. They ranged from a perverse enjoyment of cruelty and the sheer thrill of dominance, to a bizarre, desperate interest in black magic, necromancy, and alchemy. He believed that the sacrifices of these innocent children, their blood and vital organs, would aid him in discovering the philosopher's stone, grant him supernatural knowledge, or even summon demons to reveal hidden treasures, all to recoup his rapidly dwindling fortune from his extravagant lifestyle. The sheer scale, systematic nature, and chilling premeditation of his crimes are almost incomprehensible, a stark and terrifying testament to the unchecked power of a feudal lord who thought himself utterly above all law, protected by his noble status, his vast wealth, and his reputation as a war hero. This was not merely the isolated act of a single perverted individual. It was a profound societal failure, a period where immense power could, for far too long, conceal such horrors, until the sheer number of victims made silence and concealment impossible. The meticulously documented trials, conducted by both ecclesiastical, Bishop Jean de Malestroit of Nantes, and secular courts, the Duke of Brittany's officials, laid bare the full sickening extent of his monstrous acts, leading to his conviction and his subsequent execution by hanging and burning on October 26, 1440. How could such a prominent figure, a national hero of France, hide such monstrous depravity in plain sight for so many years? And what does it say about a society that, for so long, allowed such unspeakable horrors to persist, only reacting when the sheer scale became too undeniable? The chilling legacy of Gilles de Rais remains a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for extreme evil when power is absolute and unchecked. You step into the hushed, often hidden, world of the medieval church, an institution that wielded immense spiritual and temporal power, shaping every aspect of daily life, yet was paradoxically not immune to the very perversions it so vehemently condemned. Across the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, a persistent and often desperate struggle unfolded within the church itself against what was euphemistically, yet unequivocally, termed unnatural vice. This phrase, in the theological and legal discourse of the time, primarily referred to acts of sodomy, encompassing various forms of same-sex sexual activity. You hear the condemnations from powerful synods and church councils convened across Europe, the stern warnings from influential theologians, and the decrees from popes themselves. One of the most scathing and explicit denunciations comes from Peter Damian, an influential cardinal and reformer of the 11th century. In his infamous treatise, Liber Gomorrhaenus, Book of Gomorrah, written around 1049, Damian explicitly detailed a pervasive and deeply concerning problem within monastic orders and among the secular clergy. He described various forms of sexual transgression between men, condemning them as a filth that defiles the whole body of the church, and a widespread leprosy that threatened to corrupt the entire institution. Imagine the profound internal conflict, the stark hypocrisy of an institution that preached moral purity, demanded celibacy from its clergy, and fiercely condemned unnatural acts as mortal sins, while simultaneously grappling with such widespread issues within its own ranks. While the records are often veiled in euphemisms and allegories, due to the extreme taboo surrounding the subject, the sheer volume and consistency of these condemnations, the repeated legislation against such practices in canon law, and the increasingly severe punishments prescribed, ranging from defrocking, penance, and imprisonment to, in some extreme cases for incorrigible or unrepentant offenders, being burned at the stake, indicate a problem that was far from isolated or sporadic. Bishops and abbots struggled relentlessly to enforce celibacy and moral conduct, often facing resistance or outright defiance from clergy who, isolated from female companionship and living in close quarters, found solace, affection, and sexual expression with one another. The theological justifications for condemning sodomy as the most grievous of sexual sins were rooted in interpretations of biblical passages like the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and philosophical arguments about the natural order of creation. This wasn't necessarily about a king in the traditional sense, but about a powerful societal and spiritual structure, the church, where such acts occurred, sometimes by those in positions of profound authority, abbots, bishops, even cardinals, under the very cloak of religious sanctity. This created a profound dissonance between preached doctrine and lived reality, an internal struggle that had significant implications for the church's moral authority and its relationship with its faithful. The tension between the ideal of clerical celibacy and the realities of human nature often led to hidden transgressions, hypocrisy, and widespread attempts at concealment, all while the church publicly presented an image of unblemished moral rectitude. What does it mean for an institution's moral authority and its spiritual mission when its own members are accused, consistently, of the very sins they condemn as an abomination? And how did this profound internal struggle shape the church's ongoing efforts to control human sexuality throughout the medieval period and beyond? Journey now to the heart of the 15th century, to the German lands of the Holy Roman Empire, and immerse yourself in the unsettling story of Count Eberhard VI of Württemberg, who would later become Duke Eberhard I the Bearded, reigned as Count from 1459, as Duke from 1495 to 1496. Initially, Eberhard was widely celebrated as an enlightened and wise ruler, known for his profound learning, his patronage of scholarship and the arts, and his foundational role in establishing the renowned University of Tübingen in 1477, which attracted some of Europe's finest minds. He was seen as a unifying force, instrumental in achieving the Treaty of Munsingen in 1482, which effectively unified the partitioned Württemberg territories. Yet, despite this outwardly impressive facade of intellectualism and statesmanship, whispers of his private life painted a far darker, deeply disturbing picture, earning him the chilling nickname the Monster of the Vosges among some who knew, or suspected, his true nature. You hear accounts, deliberately vague and rarely explicitly detailed due to the extreme dangers of openly criticizing a powerful, unpredictable ruler, that suggest a profound penchant for sadism and a fascination with unconventional, often violent sexual practices. Imagine the psychological torment inflicted upon those unfortunate souls. often young men or vulnerable servants within his own court and household, who found themselves subject to his dark, capricious desires. While precise historical records are understandably scant and euphemistic on the exact nature of his perversions, no chronicler dared to openly record such heinous acts of a ruling prince. The persistent rumors, the pervasive fear he inspired among his household staff, and indirect allusions in contemporary private letters and diplomatic reports all point to something far beyond simple infidelity or common debauchery. This wasn't about love, nor even lust in the conventional sense. It was about a twisted manifestation of absolute power and control, where sexual acts were intertwined with dominance, humiliation, and perhaps even extreme cruelty, a chilling form of personal tyranny. His public reputation as a strict, almost puritanical, reformer and a stern, unyielding judge who meted out harsh justice stood in stark and terrifying contrast with the terrifying whispers of his private life. This duality created a profound and disturbing dichotomy. A man who founded a celebrated university and unified a fragmented realm, yet allegedly engaged in deeply perverse and abusive acts behind the closed doors of his palaces, particularly in his residences near the Vosges Mountains. This stark contrast between his outwardly virtuous persona and his alleged private depravity reveals a chilling truth about the hidden lives of medieval nobility and the virtual impunity that often accompanied immense, unchecked power, allowing monstrous behaviors to flourish in secret. How could a man so revered for his wisdom and statesmanship in one sphere be so reviled, even feared, in another? And what does this profound moral duality reveal about the deeply unsettling hidden lives of medieval nobility, where power could act as a cloak for the darkest of human impulses? You find yourself transported to the vibrant, yet undeniably treacherous, court of 16th century France, a period dominated by the formidable and often ruthless figure of Catherine de' Medici, 1519 to 1589, Queen Mother. While not a king herself, her influence over her sons, particularly King Charles IX and later King Henry III, was absolute, a masterful exercise in power behind the throne. And central to her web of political intrigue was her infamous, almost legendary, creation, what was known as the Flying Squadron, l'Escadron Volant. This wasn't a military unit, nor a formal espionage network in the modern sense, but a carefully selected group of exquisitely beautiful, highly intelligent, and often cunning noblewomen who served as Catherine's most effective spies. Manipulators and honey traps, you witnessed them at court, moving through the opulent halls, their beauty a potent weapon, their charm a finely honed tool for extracting secrets, influencing powerful men, and subtly steering political events in Catherine's favor. Imagine the intricate web of seduction, flattery, and deceit woven by these women, all operating under Catherine's watchful, calculating eye, their conversations casual, yet meticulously aimed. The perversion here lies not just in the sexual manipulation itself, though that was certainly a core component. It resides more profoundly in the calculated, cynical, and utterly ruthless use of human desires, vulnerabilities, and intimacy for cold, hard political gain. These women, often pressured by Catherine or driven by their own ambition for influence, were encouraged, if not directly instructed, to engage in affairs with influential courtiers, ambassadors, and even foreign princes. Their liaisons were not about love or genuine affection, but about gathering vital intelligence, subtly altering allegiances, and even compromising opponents, all for the direct benefit of the crown and Catherine's Machiavellian agenda to maintain the fragile Valois dynasty and her own control. It was a chillingly pragmatic approach to power, where personal relationships and sexual intimacy were reduced to mere instruments of statecraft, stripping the individuals involved of their emotional autonomy and dignity. The moral implications were profound. blurring the lines between personal agency and political servitude, as these women became unwitting, or sometimes all too willing, pawns in a grand strategic game for the future of France. While the kings themselves, Charles IX and Henry III, might have been directly involved in these affairs, either as targets of manipulation or as willing participants in the court's libertine atmosphere, the true mastermind behind this sophisticated network of sexual intrigue was Catherine. She demonstrated an unparalleled mastery of human weakness and an exceptional ability to weaponize desire and intimate knowledge. This strategy, while undoubtedly effective for a time in a court rife with political factionalism, ultimately contributed to the pervasive distrust, cynicism, and moral decay within the French court, leaving a lasting legacy of cynical manipulation and a chilling precedent for the use of sexual politics in power struggles. What does it truly mean when the most intimate aspects of human life are systematically weaponized for political control? And what profound psychological toll did such a system take on both the manipulators and the manipulated, forever altering their perception of trust and human connection? Journey to the mid-15th century, a period of profound political upheaval and dynastic struggles across Central Europe, and immerse yourself in the brief, tragic, and unsettling life of Ladislaus the Posthumous, 1440 to 1457. King of Hungary and Bohemia, and Duke of Austria. His very existence was shrouded in political intrigue from the moment of his birth. He was born 4 months after his father, Albert II of Germany, died, hence his epithet, the Posthumous. His entire short life was a pawn in the relentless power games of the Habsburgs and the Hungarian and Bohemian nobility, marked by constant political manipulation and a profound lack of personal freedom, as he was largely kept as a ward by his powerful guardian, Emperor Frederick III. You hear the unsettling rumors that circulated about his intended marriages, particularly his engagement to Madeleine of France, daughter of the powerful King Charles VII. Ladislaus, a notoriously sickly and perhaps psychologically fragile or immature young man, was said to have had a bizarre and unsettling fascination with his prospective brides. Imagine the profound discomfort, even outright fear, of these young women, often mere children themselves, thrust into the cruel spotlight of dynastic politics, facing a suitor whose behavior was far from the conventional, chivalrous ideal. Accounts from contemporary chroniclers and diplomatic reports, though somewhat veiled by the courtly language of the time and the deference afforded to royalty, hint at an almost perverse immaturity and a deeply unsettling curiosity about the physical attributes of his future queens in a way that bordered on the obsessive, perhaps even voyeuristic for a royal groom. Some sources mention his almost clinical fascination with portraits of his potential brides, scrutinizing them with an intensity that went beyond simple admiration, delving into an unnerving preoccupation with their physical form. A chilling anecdote speaks to his peculiar fixations. It was reported that he commissioned highly detailed, even explicit, drawings of his betrothed, or perhaps even insisted on viewing them in private, focusing on their physical characteristics rather than their personality or shared interests. Such behavior, even if exaggerated by rumor, would have been highly irregular and disturbing for the time, reflecting a profound lack of social grace or a deeper psychological peculiarity. He died suddenly in Prague in November 1457 at the mere age of 17, amidst elaborate preparations for his wedding to Magdalena of France. His untimely death immediately sparked rampant speculation of poisoning by his political enemies, given the stakes of his marriage. However, modern historical consensus, based on scientific examination of his remains in the 20th century, points to the most likely cause being a swift and severe case of the bubonic plague or a related illness, possibly leukemia. His short, troubled life and the unsettling details surrounding his personal conduct paint a picture of a king who, whether due to chronic illness, profound psychological immaturity, or the crushing, dehumanizing pressures of his royal destiny, displayed deeply unusual and disturbing tendencies concerning his marital obligations. His inability to conform to conventional royal behavior, even in the most private of matters, highlights the immense and sometimes perverse psychological burden placed upon child monarchs and royal pawns in an era of relentless dynastic and political maneuvering where their very bodies were instruments of state. What kind of psychological burden does a king's title and the constant scrutiny of a court place on a young, fragile mind, twisting even the most natural human desires into something unsettling and deeply strange? Now, delve into the late 14th century, a period of mounting instability and simmering discontent in Central Europe, and fix your gaze upon the reign of King Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia and Germany, reigned 1378 to 1419. Wenceslaus, the son of the revered Emperor Charles IV, was a ruler infamous not only for his political incompetence and negligence, but perhaps more strikingly, for his erratic behavior and, by many accounts, his profoundly depraved indulgences. You observe a king who, despite possessing a sharp intellect and an early passion for justice and legal reform, was notoriously prone to violent outbursts, bouts of severe melancholia, and excessive, debilitating drinking. The court chroniclers of the time, such as Johannes von Sas and the Chronica Bohmerm, paint a vivid and deeply troubling picture of a monarch who increasingly preferred the coarse company of executioners, prostitutes, and low-born commoners to that of his nobles, advisors, or even his own family. He often conducted his affairs, such as they were, in seedy taverns rather than the dignified royal palace. Imagine the shock, dismay, and growing terror of the court when the king, in a drunken rage or a sudden fit of madness, would order the summary execution of perceived enemies, or even innocent servants who displeased him. There are chilling accounts of him personally participating in acts of violence or forcing others to commit atrocities. One particularly horrific and widely reported account details how, during a fit of uncontrollable rage in 1393, Wenceslaus allegedly ordered a royal cook to be roasted alive on a spit, simply for failing to prepare a meal to his liking. This was not merely about a quick temper. It was about an utter disregard for human life and a disturbing delight in suffering. But beyond the overt violence, whispers circulated about his more perverted tastes. It's said that he maintained a private harem, not just for conventional pleasure, but for sadistic games and disturbing experiments, fueled by his dark moods, his alcohol consumption, and his utterly uncontrolled whims. His alleged delight in watching people being tortured, an almost voyeuristic pleasure in the infliction of extreme pain, further cemented his terrifying reputation for cruelty and depravity. His increasingly tyrannical, erratic, and scandalous behavior was so profound that it ultimately led to his deposition as King of the Romans, the German king, in 1400 by the imperial electors, who could no longer tolerate his misrule and debauchery. He retained his title as King of Bohemia, but his authority was severely diminished, and his reign plunged Bohemia into decades of instability that contributed to the Hussite Wars. This wasn't just about a king with numerous mistresses, which was common enough. It was about a monarch whose absolute power, combined with severe psychological instability and a deep penchant for cruelty, enabled him to explore the darkest corners of human sadism and sexual deviance without fear of reprisal for years, leaving a legacy of terror, instability, and moral decay that plagued his kingdom long after his death. How does absolute power, when combined with a deeply troubled mind, turn a man's flaws into horrific acts, warping his very humanity and driving an entire kingdom to rebellion and ultimately to cast him down from his high perch? You are now in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. a period poised between the true medieval and the early modern, in the shadow of the imposing Carpathian Mountains, where the legend of Elizabeth Bathory, often chillingly called the Bloody Countess, still sends shivers down spines and fuels countless horrifying tales. While not a queen in her own right, her immense noble status and her extensive connections to some of the most powerful royal families across Europe are undeniable. She was a Hungarian countess from the immensely powerful and ancient Bathory family, related through marriage to the Hungarian nobility, the reigning princes of Transylvania, and even the King of Poland, Stephen Bathory. Her lineage placed her among the absolute elite of European aristocracy, granting her extraordinary privilege and autonomy. The tales you hear, rooted in contemporary depositions and later legal proceedings, are unspeakably horrific. That between approximately 1585 and 1609, over a span of nearly a quarter century, she systematically tortured and murdered hundreds of young women. These victims were primarily peasant girls from the surrounding villages, lured to her various formidable castles, most notably Lactis Castle in what is now Slovakia, by deceptive promises of work as maids or servants. Later, as her appetite for cruelty grew and her need for secrecy intensified, she began to target even the daughters of lesser nobility, who were sent to her castle for refinement and education. Imagine the utter terror that must have gripped the local villagers, knowing their daughters were disappearing into her formidable fortress, never to be seen again, their pleas for help falling on deaf ears, while the exact number of her victims is debated by modern historians, ranging from dozens to perhaps as many as 650, the number claimed by one witness. The contemporary accounts and her eventual conviction in 1610 to 1611 speak of a depravity that beggars belief. Her methods of torture were numerous and appalling. Severe beatings, mutilation, burning with hot irons, freezing them to death in snow, starving them, and puncturing their flesh with needles. The most sensational and enduring claim, often repeated in popular lore, is that she bathed in the blood of virgins, believing it would preserve her youth and beauty. While this particular bloodbath claim is generally viewed by modern historians as a later embellishment or a sensationalized folklore element added to the already horrifying truth, the reality of her sadistic acts, meticulously documented by witnesses, remains terrifying. Her acts were driven by a twisted vanity, a profound sense of entitlement, and a sadistic pleasure in inflicting pain, exacerbated by the isolation of her position, the immense power she wielded, and the unwavering loyalty of her complicit servants. The royal connection here is crucial. Her immense wealth, powerful lineage, and the deeply entrenched feudal system of the time allowed her to commit these atrocities for years with near impunity, as local authorities and even the Hungarian Palatine, György Thurzo, feared challenging such a high-ranking noblewoman. The state only intervened when the sheer scale of the disappearances became too grand to ignore, and noble families began to formally complain about their daughters vanishing. This dark saga highlights a chilling truth of the era. Even when not kings themselves, those connected to the highest echelons of power and nobility could literally get away with murder, and far worse, for an astonishing period of time, demonstrating the terrifying fragility of justice in a world dominated by absolute aristocratic privilege. What dark impulses could drive a noblewoman of such standing to such monstrous acts? And how could such pervasive horrors remain hidden for so long within the very heart of the nobility, leaving an indelible stain on the annals of Hungarian history? Travel now to the early 15th century, a tumultuous period marked by the Great Western Schism, which saw rival popes claiming authority and the devastating Hussite Wars, and immerse yourself in the sprawling, often chaotic, court of Sigismund of Luxembourg, 1368 to 1437. Sigismund was a figure of immense political ambition and skill, eventually rising to become King of Hungary Bohemia, and ultimately the Holy Roman Emperor, crowned 1433. He is widely celebrated for his pivotal role in bringing an end to the Western Schism at the Council of Constance, 1414 to 1418, and for his tireless, though often unsuccessful, efforts to unite Christendom against the Ottoman threat. Yet, despite his grand political achievements and his intellectual pursuits, his personal life was a tapestry woven with shifting loyalties, both political and romantic, and his court gained a widespread reputation for its undeniable licentiousness. You observe a monarch who, despite his immense responsibilities and diplomatic endeavors across Europe, was notoriously promiscuous. Chroniclers of the time, both within his court and external observers, hinted at numerous mistresses and a veritable parade of illegitimate children, accumulating a widespread reputation for boundless carnal appetites that sometimes overshadowed his statecraft and his pious pronouncements. Imagine the intricate web of personal relationships, rivalries, and jealousies that must have existed within such a court, where the king's affections could rapidly elevate or brutally destroy careers, and where paternity could create new contenders for power or complicate existing dynastic claims. This wasn't just about the occasional extramarital affair, which was common enough among medieval monarchs. It was about a systematic and open disregard for marital fidelity, even towards his two empresses, and a courtly culture that seemed to normalize a boundless and casual promiscuity at the highest echelons of power, while not necessarily perverted in a violent or sadistic sense. His widespread promiscuity and the permissive, morally lax atmosphere of his court were seen by many, particularly reform-minded clergy and moralists, as a significant moral failing that undermined his image as a virtuous Christian ruler, especially given his role in healing the church's schism. Furthermore, his use of sexual relationships often transcended mere personal pleasure. They were subtly employed for political gain, influencing allegiances, securing favors, and cementing diplomatic ties, adding another layer of complexity and cynicism to his personal life. The constant flow of new favorites, the public acknowledgement of his numerous bastards, whom he often treated with remarkable generosity and granted significant positions, and the casual disregard for conventional marital fidelity created an environment of profound moral ambiguity. Here, personal pleasure and raw political ambition intertwined in unsettling ways, presenting a stark contrast to the religious fervor he often publicly displayed and the pious rhetoric he employed in his crusading efforts. How does a king maintain a facade of religious devotion, even positioning himself as a leader of Christendom, while openly indulging in such widespread and undeniable promiscuity? And what impact did this profound moral dissonance have on his ability to rule effectively and inspire genuine, unquestioning loyalty among his subjects and allies? You're transported to the opulent, yet profoundly secretive world of 15th century Venice, a powerful maritime republic that stood as a beacon of trade, wealth, and unique governance. Here, power was wielded not by a king, but by an elected doge, the chief magistrate who, though carefully constrained by an oligarchical council, still held immense symbolic and practical authority. The doge's palace and the grand residences of the wealthy patrician families were the true centers of power, immense wealth and often hidden depravity, where the city's unique culture of secrecy and masked identity allowed for unparalleled indulgence. You hear whispers, hushed and tantalizing, of the infamous masked revels that took place behind the closed doors of Venetian palaces, particularly during the lengthy and legendary carnival season, which could stretch for months, offering an extended period of social and moral license. These weren't merely innocent celebrations or festive gatherings. They were elaborate, carefully orchestrated opportunities for unchecked indulgence, where the pervasive anonymity provided by the exquisite Venetian masks offered a perfect impenetrable cover for illicit encounters, forbidden pleasures, and social transgressions that would be unthinkable in daylight. Imagine the intoxicating freedom that a mask could offer to a person of high standing, allowing individuals, including the Doge himself and his elite circle of powerful patricians, to shed their public personas, their official duties, and their moral reputations. Behind the anonymity of the Bada or the Moretta mask, they could engage in acts that would be scandalous, reputation-destroying, and even legally punishable if their identities were known. While specific, explicit historical accounts of individual doges engaging in overt perversions are incredibly scarce, primarily due to the highly guarded nature of Venetian politics, where maintaining the Republic's pristine image was paramount and scandal was rigorously suppressed by the ruling elite. The very culture of elaborate masked balls, private gambling dens, and secret rendezvous speaks volumes. Venice's unique labyrinthine urban layout, with its narrow alleyways, hidden passageways, secluded courtyards, and cloaked figures moving silently by gondola, inherently facilitated a world where private vices could flourish unseen under the very nose of the public. This architectural and cultural design created an environment ripe for clandestine activities and uninhibited indulgence. The emphasis was always on discretion, ensuring that the public image of piety, republican virtue, and moral uprightness remained untarnished, even as the most bizarre, unconventional, and often morally ambiguous desires were indulged behind closed doors. This created a profound and pervasive hypocrisy within the Republic, where outward appearances were meticulously maintained and civic virtues lauded, while a vibrant, often depraved underworld thrived in secret, known only to its participants. What kind of moral compromises does a society make when it prioritizes appearances and the meticulous maintenance of a virtuous public image over genuine virtue, allowing hidden depravities and mass transgressions to flourish at its very heart, shaping a unique and often unsettling culture of secrecy and indulgence? Journey now to the heart of the 15th century, a period of unparalleled artistic, cultural, and economic flourishing in Europe, and immerse yourself in the magnificent yet undeniably decadent court of Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, reigned 1419 to 1467. Though technically a duke and a vassal of the French king, Philip's vast and immensely wealthy territories, encompassing much of modern-day Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, allowed his court to rival, and in many respects surpass, that of any European monarch in terms of wealth, power, and sheer lavishness. Burgundy under Philip was a de facto kingdom, a cultural powerhouse that set trends for fashion, art, and courtly life across the continent. You witnessed the overwhelming opulence, the extravagant feasts, where exotic dishes were served on gold plate, the grand tournaments showcasing unparalleled chivalric display, and the prolific patronage of renowned artists like Jan van Eyck and Rogier van der Weyden, whose works still captivate us today. But beneath this glittering, highly cultivated surface lay a darker undercurrent of moral laxity and unchecked indulgence. Philip himself was renowned not only for his political acumen, but for his numerous mistresses and an extraordinary number of illegitimate children, accumulating a staggering total of 16 acknowledged bastards, including the famous and highly favored Anthony, Grand Bastard of Burgundy, whom he educated, knighted, and empowered. Imagine the sheer scale of his personal entourage, a sprawling network filled with concubines and children, all vying for his attention, favor, and the significant financial allowances and political positions he bestowed upon them. This wasn't just about the occasional extramarital affair, a common enough occurrence among medieval royalty. It was about a systematic, open, and almost celebrated disregard for marital fidelity, a blurring of lines between legitimate and illegitimate offspring, and a pervasive courtly culture that normalized boundless and casual promiscuity at the highest echelons of power. While not perversion in the most extreme, violent, or sadistic sense, the sheer scale of his sexual conquests, the casual acceptance of such prolific illegitimacy within his inner circle, and his insatiable pursuit of sensual gratification reflects a profound moral decadence. The court of Burgundy became a symbol of unrestrained pleasure, where the pursuit of personal, sensual gratification often overshadowed solemn duties, religious piety, and strict moral rectitude. Despite Philip's public displays of devotion and his patronage of religious foundations, this created a moral atmosphere where excess was normalized and personal indulgence was seen as a prerogative of power. The impact of such widespread libertinism on the moral fabric of the court and the perception of the ducal family was undeniable, showcasing a powerful ruler whose personal life was defined by an almost boundless appetite for pleasure and procreation, setting a pervasive tone for his entire domain. How does the relentless pursuit of pleasure and personal gratification become an end in itself, potentially undermining the very foundations of power and authority? And what does such overt, normalized decadence reveal about the underlying values of a powerful ruler and his influential court? You now stand in the court of late 14th and early 15th century France, a kingdom grappling with the renewed devastation of the 100 Years' War and the profound instability stemming from its monarch. Here, you observe the tragic, deeply unsettling figure of King Charles VI, reigned 1380 to 1422, a ruler whose mental state earned him the chilling sobriquet Charles the Mad, Charles le Fol, or Charles le Bename in his calmer moments. While his story isn't one of deliberate sexual perversion or calculated cruelty in the typical sense, his periodic, severe bouts of mental illness led to deeply bizarre, unpredictable, and often profoundly inappropriate behaviors that the court struggled desperately to comprehend, manage, and conceal from a superstitious populace. You witness his sudden, terrifying fits of violence, which could erupt without warning, threatening anyone nearby. You observe his chilling delusions. At times, he believed he was made of glass and feared shattering, forcing him to wear protective padding and avoid movement. At other times, he would refuse to bathe or change clothes for months, believing he was a saint. Perhaps most heartbreakingly, he suffered from terrifying episodes where he completely lost his memory and ability to recognize his own family, including his devoted wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, for extended periods, even claiming he had no wife or children. Imagine the profound terror and confusion of courtiers and family members watching their king, the very symbol of France's stability and divine legitimacy, descend into such profound madness, his sanity fracturing before their very eyes. During these devastating episodes, his personal hygiene deteriorated drastically, his judgment vanished, and he would engage in erratic and often profoundly inappropriate public displays, sometimes running wildly through the palace, throwing objects, or screaming incoherently. While these behaviors are now widely understood by modern historians and psychologists as symptoms of a profound psychological affliction, likely schizophrenia or bipolar disorder in the medieval mind, they were often interpreted through a lens of divine punishment for his sins, demonic possession, or a form of spiritual corruption. This often led to bizarre cures being attempted, involving everything from exorcisms to attempts at bloodletting and even, tragically, the death of several of his attendants during his violent fits. The perversion here lies not in a deliberate, malicious intent, but in the utter breakdown of royal decorum and the public display of a king stripped bare of his dignity and mental faculties, a stark and horrifying reminder of the profound fragility of the human mind, even on the most powerful throne in Europe. The court's desperate attempts to manage and conceal his madness, to maintain the fiction of a sane and functional ruler for the sake of the kingdom's stability, often led to increasingly bizarre and ethically questionable situations, where the line between sanity and delusion blurred entirely. This prolonged royal insanity plunged France into decades of political chaos, contributing directly to the resurgence of the Hundred Years' War and the devastating civil war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians. What happens to a kingdom when its very head, the sacred embodiment of its stability and divine right, succumbs to the unpredictable chaos of the mind? And how does a court, bound by tradition and superstition, cope with such a profound and prolonged mental breakdown at its core? You delve into the shadowy, superstitious corners of medieval belief, a world where fervent religious faith coexisted uneasily with deeply ingrained folk magic and a pervasive fear of the unknown. Here, desperate human desires often led to forbidden practices, the realm of love potions and charms. While not directly tied to a king's personal perversion in every instance, these practices reveal the astonishing lengths to which individuals, from humble peasants to the highest echelons of society, including those within royal courts, would go to control or manipulate the affections, desires, and even the fertility of others, often with profoundly sinister and morally dubious implications. You hear whispers of dark concoctions and bizarre rituals. Imagine the chilling ingredients thought to compel love or lust. Strange, potent herbs gathered under specific planetary alignments, animal parts steeped in blood, and, most disturbingly, human remains or bodily fluids, all believed to possess potent magical properties. These were not harmless romantic gestures like sending a love letter. They were perceived as coercive magic, designed to strip another person of their free will, their emotional autonomy, and their consent. For example, some charms involved sprinkling powdered bones or graveyard dirt into a target's food or drink, or forcing them to consume a concoction made with menstrual blood or other bodily fluids, believing this would bind their will. Other curses or potions were designed to inflict impotence, barrenness, or ill health upon a rival in love or a disliked spouse, a profound perversion of both love and procreation. Imagine the pervasive fear and pervasive superstition that permeated every layer of medieval society. A spurned lover, an ambitious courtier seeking royal favor, a barren noblewoman desperate for an heir, or a jealous spouse might resort to seeking out such dark arts from local cunning folk, accused witches, or traveling sorcerers to achieve their aims, often with a deep sense of desperation. Court records and legal documents across Europe, particularly from the extensive inquisitorial trials, though more prevalent in the later medieval and early modern periods, occasionally reveal cases of individuals accused of using such charms, highlighting the very real belief in their efficacy and the moral panic they could induce. The lines between folk magic, maleficium, harmful magic, and genuine poisoning often blurred, leading to accusations, sometimes brutal interrogations, and frequently severe punishments, including public humiliation, imprisonment, or even burning, at the stake for those convicted of witchcraft. This widespread belief and practice reveal a profound societal undercurrent of desire for control over emotions, over destiny, over others, where even matters of the heart were subject to manipulation through dark means, often with a deeply unsettling disregard for the autonomy and dignity of the individual. The desperation to secure love, power, or progeny, particularly in an era with limited medical understanding and rigid social structures, drove people to extreme and often horrifying measures, demonstrating how easily human vulnerability could lead to exploitation and forbidden practices. What moral boundaries were fundamentally crossed when desperate individuals sought to force love or influence through magical, coercive means, and what terrifying, often tragic, consequences did these Deeply held beliefs unleash upon medieval society, both for the accusers and the accused. You now peer behind the heavy velvet curtains and through the thick stone walls of medieval royal life, gaining a rare glimpse into the secluded, often stifling, and meticulously controlled world of queens and princesses. While men held over political and military power, the private lives of royal women were often repositories of deeply guarded secrets, illicit desires, and sometimes desperate acts of perversion born not of inherent malice, but from the immense pressures of confinement, the relentless demands of dynastic ambition, or simply the fundamental human yearning for agency in a life utterly devoid of it. You hear the hushed accounts and veiled references in chronicles of queens and powerful, noble women engaging in clandestine affairs. These liaisons were not always born of genuine romantic love. Often, they were carefully calculated maneuvers for political alliances, a means to gain crucial influence over court factions, a form of personal revenge against the neglectful or abusive husband, or simply a desperate escape from the oppressive boredom and profound isolation of their arranged, often loveless marriages. Imagine the ingenious methods employed to meet lovers in secret: hidden staircases, disguised messengers, midnight rendezvous in secluded garden follies, and the intricate network of loyal ladies-in-waiting and eunuchs sworn to absolute silence, their lives dependent on maintaining the royal illusion. The constant, gnawing fear of discovery was omnipresent. Exposure could mean profound disgrace, repudiation, imprisonment in a convent or fortress, or even, as tragically seen with some English queens accused of infidelity, like Eleanor of Aquitaine's alleged affair with Geoffrey Plantagenet, or Isabella of Angoulême's possible earlier betrothal scandal, the permanent loss of status, freedom, or even execution. The pressure to produce legitimate heirs was immense, an almost unbearable burden for queens, as the very continuity of the dynasty depended on their fertility. The inability to do so sometimes led to desperate and morally ambiguous measures, from feigned pregnancies to, in the most extreme and unthinkable cases, presenting another's child as their own, a profound perversion of natural lineage, driven by dynastic imperative. While specific, explicit details of these hidden lives are often deliberately obscured or omitted by the male-dominated historical narratives, eager to preserve the myth of royal virtue and purity, and by the deliberate suppression of royal scandal. The very constraints placed upon royal women fundamentally shaped their choices. Their bodies and their wills were often treated as mere instruments of dynastic policy, their personal desires deemed irrelevant. This strict control, paradoxically, often forced their desires and ambitions into hidden, sometimes morally ambiguous or perverse channels, a quiet, defiant rebellion against a life dictated entirely by others. These hidden lives, often overshadowed by the public narratives of powerful kings and grand political events, reveal a complex tapestry of human desire, desperation, and the astonishing lengths to which individuals would go to find autonomy, passion, or even basic fulfillment within a rigid, unforgiving social structure that offered them little personal freedom. What desperate measures would you take if your entire life, and even your body, were merely instruments of dynastic power, with your own desires and humanity deemed utterly irrelevant? You emerge, blinking, from the shadows of the medieval past, from the opulent yet often horrific courts, and into the harsh, illuminating light of the present. The kings and queens, the counts and countesses, with their bizarre appetites, their twisted desires, and their profound capacities for both good and unspeakable evil, are long gone. Their magnificent castles, once impregnable fortresses of power and dark secrets, are now crumbling ruins or meticulously preserved tourist attractions, their stories largely confined to history books and popular lore. Yet, to dismiss these narratives as mere historical curiosities would be a profound oversight. The echoes of their perversions, the chilling consequences of their unchecked power, and the societal repercussions of their actions still reverberate, subtly yet undeniably, through our modern world, fundamentally shaping our understanding of morality, governance, human nature, and the very structure of society. Consider our enduring fascination with true crime and the darker side of human nature. The medieval era's most depraved rulers were, in many ways, the original celebrity villains, their monstrous stories whispered for centuries, laying the groundwork for our contemporary obsession with sensationalism, scandal, and the psychology of evil. The profound concept of absolute power corrupting absolutely remains a timeless and potent warning, not confined to dusty feudal kingdoms. It is vividly reflected in modern political scandals, the rise and fall of dictators, and the constant, vigilant need for robust checks and balances in democratic governance. Our modern legal systems, designed to protect the vulnerable and ensure justice, are in part a direct response to historical periods where rulers like King John or figures like Gilles de Rais could act with near impunity, their victims having no recourse. The societal struggles we continue to grapple with today concerning sexual morality, gender roles, consent, and the fundamental abuse of power, though now framed in different legal, social, and technological contexts, find their complex roots in the historical struggles of the past. These medieval narratives illustrate how norms evolve, how definitions of right and wrong shift, but how fundamental human vulnerabilities and the potential for exploitation persist across time. The way we scrutinize public figures, demand accountability for their actions, and strive to protect the vulnerable from those in positions of authority are all subtle yet crucial reflections of lessons painstakingly learned from eras where such safeguards were virtually non-existent. Even the psychological complexities of desire, sadism, addiction, and the intricate, often terrifying, interplay between mental illness and power, so unsettlingly evident in the medieval perverts we've explored, continue to be studied, understood, and addressed today, informing our modern psychology, criminology, and ethical frameworks. The Tour de Nesle affair, the tragic saga of Edward II, or the unspeakable horrors perpetrated by Gilles de Rais are not just dusty historical footnotes from a distant past. They are living, breathing reminders of what happens when human appetites are utterly unbound by law, by morality, or by compassion. When the powerful truly believe themselves to be above all restraint, we, as a modern society, have built elaborate systems and institutions, democratic governance, comprehensive legal frameworks, enshrined human rights, and a free press, specifically designed to prevent such abuses of power and such profound moral decay from ever recurring. But the eternal vigilance required to maintain these safeguards, to speak truth to power, and to consistently hold even the most influential accountable for their actions, is a direct and undeniable legacy of those dark, tumultuous medieval ages. You carry with you, now, the chilling knowledge that while the forms may change, the potential for perversion, for power twisted into grotesque and destructive shapes, remains an inherent, often dormant, part of the human condition. It is a constant reminder of the shadows lurking beneath the surface of even the most advanced civilization, urging us to remain ever vigilant, for history, in its darkest corners, always echoes. What lessons, then, will we truly take from these dark chapters of history, and how will we ensure these perversions remain confined to the past, rather than finding new ways to manifest in our present or future?